The sauna's dense, humid air produced a gentle mist that adhered to the wood walls. The soft hiss of water on the hot stones inside gave the otherwise silent space a rhythmic sound. A woman sat in a corner, leaning her back against the warm wooden slats and unwinding with her eyes closed. She was in her early 40s, and her skin had a faint gleam of perspiration. Her stepson had joined her earlier, sitting across from her, both of them wrapped in towels. He had been silent, sensing the tension in the air. It wasn't the first time they'd been alone together, but the closeness of the sauna made everything feel different. More charged, his eyes flickered to her, occasionally catching the way her chest rose and fell with each deep breath. Beats of sweat tracing along her collarbone and down her neck. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. It's going to be a really fascinating narrative, so make sure to watch this video through to the finish. There was a humorous edge to the silence that was broken by her kind voice. He was staring at her with a faint smile curving on her lips as she opened her eyes. "Yeah," he said. "It's just hot in here." She shifted uneasily, laughed, and leaned forward a little, slipping her towel, revealing more of her shoulder. "That's the point of a sauna," she teased. His eyes followed the movement, and his heart raced a little faster. He quickly looked away, trying to focus on anything other than the closeness between them. The way the heat intensified, not only from the steam, but also from the silent tension in the room. "You've been quiet today," she said, her tone gentle, almost coaxing something on your mind. He hesitated, unsure of how to answer without saying too much. "Just thinking about things," he said vaguely, running a hand through his damp hair. She leaned back again, resting her head against the wall and closing her eyes. "You can talk to me, you know. We've always been able to talk." "Right?" He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Yeah, we have the silence stretched on, with only the sound of steam filling the space." He was about to change the subject when she shifted again, her towel slipping lower, now fully exposing her shoulder. "Maybe it's just the heat," she said softly, almost whispering. "But it feels different in here, doesn't it?" His breath caught in his throat. "Yeah, it does," he replied. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze directly for the first time, a look in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She smiled slowly, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking. "Come, sit next to me," she said. Patting the space beside her on the bench, he hesitated for a moment, then stood and crossed the short distance between them, sitting close enough that their legs nearly touched the heat from her skin, combined with the steam, made his pulse quicken for a few moments. Neither of them spoke. She tilted her head back, exposing more of her neck, and let out a soft sigh. "I think about how much you've grown up," she murmured, her voice low, almost intimate. "You've grown out of that child." It was not the heat that caused his throat to go dry. "You've always supported me," he murmured softly. He stared at her, "and I will always be curious about what was going on." Her voice carried weight as she answered gently. It felt different this time, but the silence stretched once again. There was a charge in the air, something unspoken, but felt by both of them. "I should probably go," he said suddenly, but didn't move. It felt like the right thing to say, but everything in him was telling him to stay. She turned her head, looking at him for a moment before her eyes wandered down slightly. "Or you could stay," she whispered, barely audible but unmistakable. His breath hitched, and he didn't know what to say, but his body was responding. The closeness, the heat, the soft light of the sauna, it all blurred together. She reached out her fingers, brushing against his hand. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice a mix of reassurance and something deeper. He swallowed hard the touch of her hand, sending a shock through him. "This feels different." He said, his voice barely a whisper. "It does," she agreed, her hand lingering on his, her thumb brushing his skin. "But maybe different isn't a bad thing." He turned to look at her, their faces inches apart. The heat, the tension, the closeness. It was all too much. Without thinking, he leaned in just enough, so their foreheads touched. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the moment. Her breath warm against his lips. The steam hissed again, but neither of them paid attention. The only thing that mattered was the space between them, which was closing fast. Her hand slid up his arm, slow and deliberate, until it rested on the back of his neck. He shuddered under her touch, his body reacting to the closeness. "This feels," he started, but the words failed him. "I know," she whispered, her lips, brushing his in the softest of kisses. It was a moment suspended in time, the heat of the sauna mixing with the heat between them. The tension stretched, charged with everything unsaid. Her lips had barely touched his, but the weight of that contact sent shockwaves through him. It wasn't just the kiss, but what it meant, the line. They were so close to crossing. He froze for a moment, unsure whether to pull back or dive in, but his body made the decision for him. She pulled away, eye first, but only by a breath. Her eyes searched his silently, asking for permission to continue. He swallowed his pulse, pounding in his ears. "We shouldn't be doing this," he whispered, his voice low and husky. Yet as the words left his lips, his body betrayed him. He hadn't moved away. In fact, he leaned in just a bit more, his gaze flickering down to her lips. "I know," she whispered back, barely audible above the hiss of the steam, but it feels. She trailed off. Unable to find the right words, her hand stayed on his neck, her fingers gently playing with his damp hair. Without saying anything else, she leaned in again, this time pressing her lips to his with more intent. It wasn't a rushed kiss, but it carried weight, as if everything unspoken had been building to this point. He responded instinctively, his hand finding her waist and pulling her closer. The warmth of her skin against has made his heart race. The kiss deepened slowly, their breaths mingling in the humid air, her body pressing against his. The towel that had barely clung to her slipped lower, exposing her completely. He felt her body move beneath his touch, the heat of her skin, and the steam mixing, creating a powerful mix of sensations. As his hands roamed her waist, she tilted her head back, letting him kiss along her neck. Each touch sent shivers down her spine. She let out a soft sigh, her fingers gripping his shoulders as he kissed lower. The tension between them grew with every second. "Are you sure about this?" he murmured, his voice thick with desire, but still hesitant. She pulled back slightly, meeting his gaze. "I've never been more sure of anything," she whispered. Before he could respond, she kissed him again, this one hungrier than the last. His hands moved down her back. Finding the knot of her towel without thinking, he tugged gently and the fabric slipped away, exposing her fully to him. She gasped but made no move to stop him. Instead, she let the towel fall completely, leaving her vulnerable. Yet the look in her eyes showed she felt in control, his breath caught, his heart racing. As his hands explored her bare skin, she pressed closer, her body responding to his touch as they continued kissing. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as though time had no meaning. The heat of the sauna seemed to intensify every touch, feeling more electrifying. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, his hands caressing her body. She smiled at him, her lips curling up in a way that made his heart race even faster. "You always say the right thing," she teased lightly, though the seriousness in her eyes was clear. They held each other for a moment, their foreheads resting together, their breaths shallow. The sauna was quiet, except for the sound of the steam and the beating of their hearts. She shifted slightly, her leg brushing against his, as she adjusted her position, sending a jolt of sensation through him. He responded by pulling her even closer. Their bodies pressed flesh against each other. Now her towel, which had been hanging on by a thread, slipped further down, leaving her fully exposed. She didn't seem to mind, in fact. The vulnerability seemed to embolden her. She leaned back against the warm wooden wall, pulling him with her. Her hands found the knot of his towel, and with one quick tug, it unraveled and fell away. He gasped, his heart pounding as he felt her body against his, unimpeded by fabric. The heat of the sauna combined with the heat from our skin was overwhelming, as though the walls were closing in on them. The air was thick and heavy, with the scent of sweat and desire. For a moment they stood there, pressed against each other, breathing heavily. The intensity of the moment was dizzying, neither of them able to speak. Their eyes locked as they tried to understand what was happening between them. Then her hands were on him again, exploring his chest, his arms, her torchlight, and teasing. He groaned softly, his hands tracing her back. Feeling the curve of her spine, it felt as though he was losing control, the desire that had been simmering between them for so long. Finally, coming to a boil, she leaned in, pressing her lips to his neck, her breath warm against his skin. He shuddered his fingers, digging into her hips. As he pulled her even closer, their bodies were pressed together as though they were one. "Are you okay?" She whispered, her voice low and breathless. "Is this okay?" He nodded. Unable to speak, his eyes wide as he looked at her, she smiled softly, leaning in for another kiss, this one deeper. More urgent, they sank down onto the bench, their bodies moving together in a rhythm that felt instinctual, primal. The heat of the sauna made everything feel more intense. Their skin was slick with sweat, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. As they explored each other, time seemed to blur as they continued each touch, each kiss drawing them closer together. The steam had long since dissipated, but the heat between them only grew stronger. It felt as though the world outside the sound ceased to exist, leaving just the two of them lost in the moment. After what felt like hours, they finally slowed their bodies. Exhausted but satisfied, she rested her head on his chest, their legs tangled together. As they lay on the bench, the afterglow of their shared experience washed over them. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. When he began to speak, but the words would not come, she looked up at him with satisfied eyes as they lay there in the sauna's silence. "Yeah," she murmured, her voice drowsy with satisfaction. It was they stayed there for a long time, neither of them speaking, just enjoying the warmth of each other's presence. The tension that had been hanging over them was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding, a bond that went beyond words. Finally, she shifted, sitting up and reaching for her towel. "We should probably get out of here before we pass out from the heat," she said. With a light laugh, he smiled and nodded, reaching for his own towel. "Yeah, you're right." They dressed in silence, the intimacy of the moment lingering in the air between them. There was no awkwardness, no regret, just a quiet understanding that something between them had changed as they stepped out of the sauna and into the cool air of the house. "We'll figure it out," she murmured, as if reading his mind, and he knew they would. He looked at her, uncertain of what to say next, but she smiled at him, her eyes warm and gentle.